France's President Emmanuel Macron visits China for a three-day state visit at a tricky time in relations. Under discussion, trade and the Ukraine war, with big differences between the two. What are the divisions and what is at stake? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Tom McRae. Welcome to the programme. France's President Emmanuel Macron is in China, a visit overshadowed by major divisions on trade and geopolitics. It's his fourth visit to the country, an indication of the importance of the relationship between Paris and Beijing. France was to the fore in reaching out to China when it was emerging from isolation in the 1970s. China has in recent years become one of France's largest trading partners, but the surge in trade has seen a big shift in Beijing's favour, with China enjoying a much bigger share. Macron has also supported EU measures to redress the trade imbalance with Europe, such as tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, which Beijing says is protectionism. Now, the countries are far apart on the Ukraine war and China's economic cooperation with Russia. So with all of these differences, what's the aim of the visit for both? And can any common ground be found? We'll ask our guest shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
A grand welcome from Chinese President Xi Jinping for the French president. A guard of honor, flag-waving children, and a military band playing the national anthems of both countries, ushering Emmanuel Macron and his wife into Beijing's Great Hall of the People for his fourth state visit since taking office in 2017. After the meeting of the two presidents, the message was cooperation and overcoming their differences. Xi called on France to work with China to support a multilateral world order.
China is willing to work with France, always bearing in mind the fundamental interests of our two peoples and the long-term interests of the international community, while rejecting any interference and upholding equal dialogue and open cooperation.
For Macron, the three-day trip is a chance to equalize their trade relationship, but also to get China's help in ending the war in Ukraine. Macron wants Beijing to do more to pressure Russia to agree to a ceasefire.
I hope that China could join our call and our efforts to achieve, at the earliest possibility, at the very least, a ceasefire in the form of a moratorium of strikes targeting critical infrastructure. We must work together to achieve a just and lasting peace which respects international law.
The European Union accuses China of supplying Moscow with military components for its defense industry, something Beijing has denied. Macron is also unhappy with what he says is an unbalanced economic relationship. The EU runs a massive $357 billion trade deficit with China. In France, China is the seventh largest trading partner, but it represents 46% of the country's total trade deficit, growing to $54 billion in 2024. Macron is seeking more investment to equalize the balance of payments, saying China doesn't buy enough French products and exports too many cheap goods. Another concern is China's dominance over rare earth minerals and the controls imposed as a result of its trade war with the U.S. President Xi says France should improve its business environment for Chinese firms. Despite their talk of bettering relations, both are limited by significant political constraints. Beijing wants to maintain leverage in its negotiations with the U.S., so will be wary of doing any deals with Europe, which might affect its efforts to reach a deal with President Donald Trump, while Macron is trying to balance the responsibility of maintaining a unified European approach to China. But the visit has allowed the pair to find some common ground. Before leaving for a tour of the southwestern Chinese city of Chengdu on Friday, they made a show of signing 12 cooperation agreements in areas including nuclear energy, education, and the conservation of pandas. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, time to bring in our guest now. Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Centre for China and Globalization. He joins us from Beijing. Remi Bourgeot is an associate fellow at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. He is in Paris. Ben Aris is the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, a business media company focusing on emerging markets. He is in Berlin. Thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story today. Andy, if I can begin with you, as you are in Beijing, how is this visit actually being viewed there, and how much importance is there actually being put on the relationship with France right now?
Well, Tom, I think there is a lot of importance attached to China's relationship with France, and the way it's been framed in Western media that this is about Ukraine, this is about rebalancing the trade relationship. But I think from China's perspective, it really has three key areas that it's looking for movement with France. The first is simple and probably the most sensitive. China wants France to take a principled stand against Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi's recent escalation on Taiwan. So I think that's the first. The second is a reaffirmation that France remains committed to genuine strategic autonomy. And I think this is also equally clear. And then finally, I think what China's looking for is the least dramatic, but perhaps the most enduring. And I think Beijing wants a stable, pragmatic economic partnership, not just with France, but with Europe, that acknowledges China's centrality to Europe's green and industrial transition.
Okay, that all sounds very straightforward, as you put it, Andy, but obviously it's much more complicated than that, isn't it, Remi? What do you think are going to be the biggest challenges that need to be overcome here?
Well, France is in a very bad economic shape at the moment. It's left without real industrial strategy in particular, and most of the assumptions that were made regarding China, that we would just keep exporting advanced technology in return for cheap goods for our consumers. All these assumptions have turned wrong as China has developed much faster than expected and has even overcome lots of technological difficulties. Now Europe is rather lagging, for example, in electric vehicles. And we're left with a massive trade deficit with China, I mean, both in the case of France and Europe more generally. And what is more worrying is that this trade deficit is becoming more and more severe in technology, anything related to electronics, and that now includes electric vehicles. So it's really a key point to try to find ways to rebalance that relationship. Things have gone really wrong in terms both of macroeconomic imbalances, but really in terms of technological development, industrial strategies, and Europe and China have to find a way to protect the European market more, so that Europe also remains valuable as an export market, that it doesn't just collapse, lagging behind other economic zones, China in technology generally, but also the US in terms of digital technologies. And the European Commission, European policy has been really lagging behind in that respect, accepting all kind of instructions from the US and just reacting to developments with China in terms of electrical vehicles, but without any clear vision. For example, announcing a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, that Europe would transition entirely to electric vehicles, and then ending up with a very unstable situation, and car manufacturers which are clearly not ready for that prospect. So I think it's really key at this point to find ways of rebalancing the relationship. But all of these discussions really point to flows in the way industrial development has been conceived in Europe and in France in particular over the past few decades.
OK, Ben, do you agree with that assessment that France and by extension Europe is falling further and further behind China? And do you think that there is a way for it to remain valuable? How does it go about doing that?
There's no question it's falling behind. There was, excuse me, there was a report by Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister, released last year, which made it very plain and went into great detail saying Europe has lost its competitive edge and that it's fallen behind the States and it's fallen behind China. And Draghi was suggesting, recommended, that Europe invest some 800 billion euros a year for the next 4 years just to try and close the gap and stay in the game. And we can see it across the board. I mean, the situation in European economies is terrible. Here in Berlin, we're in the third year of recession. And in France, the situation's even worse with this spiraling budget deficit and the political paralysis. That means they can't do anything about it. And on top of that, you've got the far right breathing down the neck of people like Macron. So the economic problems are enormous. And to add to that, to make it even worse, is that as my colleague mentioned, the Chinese have changed their model from sort of cheap goods export to pouring everything into R&D, and that's now delivering in a massive way. And China is overtaking Europe in technology after technology, the electric vehicles being the most obvious example, but pretty much everything in green energy, it's surpassed it. And moreover, it's not just the tech that they've developed, it's the manufacturing tech. So not only are the solar panels coming out of China better, but they also can produce them cheaper. And again, solar panels is another good example. It was invented here in Germany. And that whole industry has died because it simply can't compete. The government looked at bailing out the few manufacturers left and decided it wasn't worth it. It's a lost race. And so Macron's gone to China to try and undo some of these problems. But I think he's facing some very deep structural problems, and that's all manifest in the trade deficit, which is enormous and growing bigger. And it comes down to France's ability to compete. And Macron's solution, as far as I understand it, is to try and persuade Chinese companies to come and invest and set up things like, EV plants and solar panel plants in France. And that would solve it. That would undo some of your trade deficit problems. But it's going to be very difficult. I mean, he's kind of demanding it, but at the same time putting up trade barriers to the import of Chinese vehicles, which the Chinese have taken umbrance at. So the talks are not going to be easy.
OK, Andy, just given what Ben was saying there about France's deficit and the political paralysis that he was talking through, does this really put China in the driving seat here? And how do you think it's going to take advantage of that?
Well, Tom, I think that to echo what our other two guests have said, I think Europe is facing really a number of challenges, not just economic, but also from a security perspective as well, how to handle the threat it sees from Russia, and it might require massive defense spending. There's clearly an immigration issue that remains unresolved, and that's leading to domestic political challenges as well. But I think fundamentally, those like Macron that are arguing that this relationship needs to be rebalanced and China needs to be doing something differently, fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of the economic challenge facing Europe. So first of all, this is a trade relationship. It is not that China is coercing or forcing Europeans to buy clothes, automobiles, consumer electronics, that these are products that are actually sought after by consumers and businesses in Europe who have a choice as to what to buy. So I think, the first step to a solution is really an accurate diagnosis. And I think this is really a self-defeating approach to say that, China is the source of this problem.
OK. Remi, if we can bring you back in here, China represents 46% of France's total trade deficit. That's at $54 billion as of last year. How does it go about trying to claw some or any of that back? Do you think it is Macron's solution here is to get to China to invest in France, like Ben was suggesting?
Yeah, investment is important, and not only really in terms of balancing the trade accounts between the two countries. Also, there's really this technological issue, France having to catch up with China, and that applies also to the rest of Europe. So usually it's the other way around. When you think of an emerging market, it learns from the more developed market. It receives investment and also technological transfer. Now this applies the other way around. Europe has to learn more from China on the technological front, not just consume Chinese technological products, but attracts investment from China, and that involves technology transfer. The same way China has benefited from massive technology transfers from Europe and the West more generally over the past 30 or years or so. So this is really a key issue, not just in terms of protective measures, trade tariffs, but really building this relationship to help Europe catch up with those technologies being developed much more in China at the moment.
Right. Ben, to help him do that, Macron's taken a large business delegation with him to China. How important is it for Macron to actually come away with some big wins here, and how likely is that?
Well, it's key, as I suggested, as my colleague just said, that the investment is the key here, that getting Chinese companies to come and invest in France, I mean, that sort of reverses the traditional FDI model where, developed countries send their companies to China or Vietnam and set up factories and the locals learn about the tech. It's like now we're in the reverse role. You could argue that the West is now the emerging market and that China's already emerged because it's ahead. And this is not a small problem. This is not just temporary hiccup in the trade relations where at the moment we're buying too many Chinese goods, so we've got a big deficit. But if we tweak the system, we can undo that. This is a fundamental problem that the emerging markets are catching up. They spent 3 decades now living in sort of the capitalist system since the end of the socialist experiment. And they've put a lot of effort, a lot of money, particularly China, into closing that gap and learning all this technology. And now they're pulling ahead. And so it needs a complete rethink. And Xi Jinping is suggesting exactly this, that he gets lectured by the Westerners on things like human rights and the Russia war in particular. But he is suggesting that we need a stable relationship. We need to get rid of interference. He's coming out with all these buzzwords. And what he's saying like that is like we need to put things on an equal basis where we can invest in your countries, you can invest in our countries. And then this is good for global prosperity, the basic economic concept of comparative advantage. You do what you're good at. And I think there's a certain amount of inertia in Europe. Macron's shown sort of arrogance when he's gone touring in Africa, that, we're the best and actually we should use your cheap labor to enrich our consumers who get cheaper products as a result. And what the emerging markets or emerged markets are now suggesting is like, no, it needs to be a two-way street, and we need to share, cooperate. And it's not happening, or at least it's going way too slowly. The last thing I mention is that he's taken all these businessmen with him, but today also Putin just arrived in India and he's done exactly the same thing. He's taken 2 planes full of businessmen and they're all proposing to invest into India, and I think they've already signed 10 deals, and so it's going much faster.
Right. One of the other major obstacles that Macron is likely to come up against is China's support for Russia. Andy, I mean, one of the aims Macron is trying to put as much pressure on China to really get a ceasefire deal across the line. We know the alliance between Russia and China. What chance of success? Has that been discussed at all? Has there been pushback from Xi?
Before I answer that, Tom, I just want to briefly add something to the economic discussion. I think, frankly, it's delusional to think that Europe wants to rebalance its trading relationship with China. I don't think investment in Europe is going to solve the problem, and here's why. Look at Volkswagen, which is, obviously a pillar of the German industrial establishment and a global leading car maker, and it just decided to move its R&D to China, where it said it can produce an electric vehicle at 50% of the cost it would take in Europe. So, these are just, the fundamental realities here. So I think it's going to be, it's delusional to think that, any kind of rebalancing can happen without some profound shifts in the economic structure in Europe. I think when it comes to the Ukrainian conflict, I think China's been consistent all along that these disputes, these disagreements really need to be solved through mutual consultation, mutual respect. And it has really taken, a very balanced view on this. So, clearly there are positions mostly in the West that say that, China's standing on the side of Russia. But I think from Beijing and from other parts of the world, including most of the global South, I don't think that is how this is seen.
Right. Well, I mean, Remi, if you can just talk to us a little bit about the leverage that France and the EU thinks it has over China when it comes to putting pressure on Russia. Does it have any leverage at all? Why is it even making it one of the aims of this visit?
Well, I do not believe Europe has much leverage in that respect. Europe has been sidelined even in the negotiations. The recent negotiations between the US and Russia involving Ukraine, but not Europe. And Europe generally on the world stage is rather isolated on that front. And it points again to the economic discussions we're having. The elephant in the room in this war has been insufficient industrial capacity all over the Western world to produce enough weapons and even basic munitions for Ukraine. So it's in a very weak position at the moment, and there's a very clear division between European leaders and the US at this point. So they clearly see that China's support for Russia is adding to their troubles, because it really adds to Russia's industrial strength to sustain this war effort. But there isn't so much they can do at this point. They're clearly not in a strong position to impose a different view on other countries, and especially on China. I think really the key discussion going on between Europe and China is much more economic. There's this sense of panic over key industrial topics, but when it comes to Russia, there isn't so much it can really do at this moment. And also, I'd like to add, there are all these tensions, and there was this escalation between China and the US, and I think on that front, Europe is somehow trying to defend its own interests. When it comes to bilateral relations with the US, there's a huge imbalance there as well, with the European Commission almost really taking orders from Washington in many respects. But when it comes to China, given the importance of rebalancing the relationship, and investment is important, but of course it's just one part of it. Lots of things have to be fixed in Europe first, and especially on the educational front. But clearly, when it comes to China, with respect to the US, Europe also is trying somehow to find its own way, and not just to follow the US leaders. It's really key to rebalance things with China directly.
Ben, just very, very quickly, if we can, from Moscow's point of view, how important is China right now, and how dependent is Russia on that relationship? Just quickly.
It's very important. It's opened its markets. It's given Russia an economic lifeline. It's buying the oil that Russia used to sell to Europe. As for dependencies, yes, it's a lot more dependent than it ever was. Nevertheless, I think the relationship that's emerging between Xi Jinping and Putin is one of mutual cooperation based on mutual interest. And then Putin's actually working hard in order to bolster his relationships with other members of the BRICS. For example, I just mentioned he's in India today, who's not a friend of China's per se. And I think this is a young organization. This is like a new sort of international community that's not part of the West. This is a new thing. And that's still developing, and they're still working out how it's all going to work. But it means that Beijing, I mean, it comes down to, it means that Beijing can't tell Putin what to do. And the idea that Macron can pressure Xi Jinping into pressuring Russia to withdraw from Ukraine is a fantasy. I mean, Xi Jinping won't do that. Moreover, even if he tried, Putin would just ignore him. I mean, he's going to follow his own national interests.
Andy, just quickly as well, at the very beginning of this discussion, you talked about China really wanting to set up a stable, pragmatic partnership with France. What exactly do you think that China needs to do to ensure that happens? What is it looking for from France right now?
Well, I think the most important thing, Tom, is just this recognition or acknowledgement of the centrality of China economically, and I would argue even diplomatically as well, to Europeans' stability and prosperity. And here I think it's important to point out, too, that China has taken a neutral stance on Russia regarding the Ukrainian conflict. It has not taken an adversarial stance, which is largely interpreted in the West as being an ally of Russia. But I think it treats Russia like any other country with normal trade relationships. Again, as many other countries in the world, India, for example, I think someone mentioned this. So I think that that's the most important point. I think that there has to be, I think, to use a very American phrase, a come to Jesus moment for European countries to recognize the reality is that China has enormous cost advantages, which it's had for a long time, increasingly technological advantages. And it's only going to, I think China's going to advance with the 15th five-year plan with an emphasis on advanced manufacturing. Robotics certainly looks like an area that China's positioned to lead, not only from a technological perspective, but from a manufacturing perspective as well. So, again, it's hard to see how without a fundamental re-envisioning of Europe, of Europe's conception of itself and its role in the world, that it really is going to be, a hard road ahead for Europe.
Okay, obviously a lot of work to be done. Thank you so much, Andy, Remi and Ben. We really do appreciate it. We're out of time. Thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thanks so much, you two, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That is aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here. Goodbye for now.